You ask, and the room stays quiet. Again, you know this prayer by heart. Now, you've said it so many times it almost stopped feeling like faith and started feeling like stubbornness. And somewhere in that silence, a thought creeps in that you'd never say out loud. What if God isn't actually answering? What if the quiet itself is the answer? You start replaying every prayer, every word, searching for what you might have done wrong. Too much doubt, too little faith, too long without breaking. But what if you've been reading the silence completely wrong? What if the very thing you've called absence has actually been God working the whole time? Just somewhere you can't see yet. 5 things are happening right now that tell you he's closer to answering than you think. And the first one will completely change how you hear his silence. There is a kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You can rest for 8 hours and still wake up carrying it. It is the tiredness of asking the same question for the 100th time and hearing the same nothing in response. You have prayed this prayer before. You know its words by heart now, the way you know an old song, except this song never seems to end, and no one ever turns the lights back on. You ask, and you wait, and the waiting starts to feel less like a pause and more like a verdict. Somewhere in the quiet, a thought begins to take root, one you don't say out loud because it sounds almost rebellious to admit it. Maybe God isn't listening, or worse, maybe he is listening, and the silence itself is the answer. Maybe the answer is no, and you are simply too afraid to hear it named. You go back over your prayers, searching them the way you might search an old letter for some clue you missed. Did I say it wrong? Did I not believe enough? Did I doubt too openly? Complain too loudly? Ask for too much? Want too plainly? You begin building a case against yourself, brick by brick, because somehow self-blame feels more bearable than the alternative thought that maybe nothing you do will change anything, that maybe this is simply how it will stay. There is a particular ache in praying for something for so long that you start to forget what hope without exhaustion even feels like. You remember a time when you believed easily, when faith felt light, almost natural, before disappointment came and made you more careful with your hope. Now you measure your hope out in small portions, afraid to spend too much of it on something that might not come. You still function. You go to work. You answer messages. You make dinner. You show up for the people who need you. And from the outside, nothing about you looks broken. But there is a quiet you carry home at the end of each day. A low hum of grief that doesn't have a name yet. The grief of asking and watching the same unchanged landscape stretch out in front of you. You wonder sometimes if other people can sense it, this low frequency of disappointment running underneath your normal voice, your normal face, your normal life. Probably not. You have gotten good at hiding it. Too good. Maybe. You scroll through your phone and see other people's answered prayers, their breakthroughs, their good news, and something twists in your chest, not quite envy, but close to it, a tired kind of longing. Why them? Why not you? Why now for them? And still nothing for you. You catch yourself comparing your unanswered prayer to someone else's answered one, and immediately you feel ashamed for comparing at all, as if your faith should be strong enough not to notice these things, as if true believers never feel the sting of being passed over. But you do feel it, and pretending you don't only adds a second layer of exhaustion on top of the first. There is the tiredness of waiting, and then there is the tiredness of having to look fine while you wait. You have started to wonder if maybe this isn't about timing at all, if maybe you have somehow disqualified yourself from the answer altogether. You replay old mistakes, old seasons you're not proud of, wondering if this is some kind of consequence, some deleted cost you are now paying. The mind is relentless when it doesn't have an answer to hold on to. It will manufacture one, even a painful one, just to have something solid to stand on. Anything feels better than complete uncertainty. So you tell yourself stories about why this hasn't happened yet, and most of those stories make you the problem. Meanwhile, you keep praying because something in you refuses to fully stop, even when you don't feel hopeful saying the words. Maybe that refusal is its own kind of faith, though it doesn't feel like faith in the moment. It feels like stubbornness, like holding onto a rope with your hands raw. Not because you believe rescue is coming, but because letting go feels unthinkable. You think about what it would mean to truly give up asking, and something in you recoils from that thought immediately. So you keep praying into what feels like an empty room, not because you're confident anyone is on the other side, but because some quiet instinct in you refuses to let the line go dead. And this is where the real question begins to surface. The one underneath all the smaller questions about timing and worthiness and mistakes. It isn't really, why hasn't this happened yet? It is something deeper, something more frightening to say out loud. Is God actually still paying attention to me? Has he forgotten this particular ache, this specific request, this version of you that keeps showing up night after night with the same plea? Or is it possible, somehow, that the silence you've interpreted as absence has actually been something else this whole time? Something you haven't had the eyes to see yet? That question sits heavy and unanswered, because right now, you genuinely don't know. All you know is the waiting, and the way it has worn grooves into your patience, and the way your prayers have started to sound more like exhausted whispers than confident declarations. You don't have the energy to perform certainty anymore. You just want to know if this silence means what you fear it means, or if there is something happening underneath it that you simply cannot see from where you're standing. And that question, unanswered for now, is exactly where we need to begin. There is a quiet belief that tends to form in the soul without ever being spoken directly. And it sounds something like this: if God were truly listening, I would see something by now. Silence has become, in your mind, a kind of evidence. No change in circumstance, no movement, no breakthrough. So surely that must mean no response at all. This is the misunderstanding sitting underneath so much of the exhaustion, the quiet ache that has been building for weeks or months or years. You have learned, without realizing it, to measure God's faithfulness only by what you can see, touch, or confirm with your own eyes. If the door doesn't open, you assume no one is on the other side of it. If the answer doesn't arrive in the form you expected, you assume the request was never received at all. It feels logical. It feels like the only reasonable conclusion to draw from prolonged silence. But it is worth pausing here and asking a different question, one that gently challenges the foundation of that belief. What if silence is not the absence of activity, but the presence of a different kind of activity, one happening in a place you simply cannot observe directly? Think about how a seed behaves underground. From the surface, nothing appears to be happening. No green shoot, no visible sign of life, nothing to photograph or point to as proof that something is changing. And yet underground, in the dark, in the hidden soil, the seed is doing the most important work it will ever do. It is breaking open. It is sending down roots before it ever sends up a stem. If that seed could think and worry the way we do, it might spend that entire season convinced that nothing was happening, that it had been forgotten, buried, left to rot in silence. But the silence was never absence. It was preparation, happening exactly where it needed to happen. Away from sight, away from premature exposure, away from the kind of attention that would have disturbed the process before it was ready. This is closer to how waiting actually functions in a life of faith. Scripture consistently describes seasons, not single moments, when it comes to the things that matter most. Character is shaped over time. Trust is deepened through repetition, through choosing to believe again and again in the absence of immediate proof. Timing is aligned not only in your life, but often in the lives and circumstances of others connected to your situation, things you cannot see and would not even know to pray about. What feels to you like an unbearable delay may actually be a complex, careful alignment taking place behind the scenes. The way a master craftsman takes far longer on the piece that matters most, refusing to rush the parts that will determine whether the final work holds together or falls apart under pressure. This reframing does not erase the pain of waiting, and it would be dishonest to pretend it does. But it does begin to shift the question you are asking. Instead of asking, why is nothing happening? You can begin to ask, what might be happening that I simply cannot see yet? This single shift, subtle as it sounds, begins to loosen the grip of despair just slightly. Because despair feeds on the belief that you have been abandoned, while hope can survive even in silence if it believes something is still moving underneath the surface. Consider, too, how this misunderstanding affects the way you pray. When you believe silence equals absence, prayer prayer slowly turns into something closer to negotiation or performance. You search for the right words, the right posture, the right amount of faith, hoping that if you simply say it correctly enough, the silence will finally break. This creates an exhausting cycle because you begin to treat God less like a present, attentive father, and more like a distant judge who must be persuaded. But what if the goal of this season was never to perfect your performance in prayer, but to deepen your trust in the praying itself, regardless of the immediate outcome? What if the very fact that you are still showing up, still whispering the same request into what feels like a quiet room, is itself a sign of something forming in you that could not have formed any other way? There is something significant happening when a person continues to pray honestly, even when results are absent. It reveals a kind of trust that is not dependent on visible reward, a trust that is being built specifically in the dark. Because trust built only in the light of immediate answers tends to be shallow, easily shaken by the next season of silence that inevitably comes. This does not mean you must pretend the waiting doesn't hurt or force a kind of fake peace over genuine pain. It means you are invited to consider that the pain and the preparation might be happening at the very same time, intertwined rather than opposed. The ache of unanswered prayer and the slow forming of a deeper trust are not necessarily contradictions. They may be two sides of the very same season. As you sit with this, a new question begins to surface, quieter than the first, but just as important. If God is doing something hidden during this waiting, something underneath the soil where you cannot see it, what exactly does that hidden work look like? Is it simply patience? Is it character? Is it something more specific, more personal to you? Something only this particular season of silence could produce? That question remains only partially answered for now. Enough to give you something to hold on to, but not enough to remove the tension completely. The waiting is not yet explained. It is simply being reframed gently as something that might be working for you rather than against you, even though the proof of that has not yet arrived. Once you begin to consider that the silence might be doing something rather than meaning nothing, a second fear tends to surface, one that is often more painful than confusion ever was. It is the fear that the delay is not preparation at all, but punishment. Somewhere in the quiet of waiting, a thought creeps in, almost too uncomfortable to examine directly. What if this is happening because of something I did? What if I am being made to wait as a consequence? A kind of spiritual debt I am now repaying through silence. This fear rarely announces itself clearly. It usually disguises itself as self-reflection, as humility, as taking responsibility. But there is a difference between examining your life honestly before God and quietly, believing that He is now withholding love or attention as a form of discipline measured out in delay. That belief, if left unchallenged, will slowly poison the way you relate to Him. It turns prayer into something closer to probation, where you must somehow prove you have suffered enough or learned enough before being released into the answer you've been asking for. But this understanding does not match the way preparation actually works in a life surrendered to God. Punishment and preparation may look similar from a distance, both involving waiting, both involving discomfort, but they are fundamentally different in purpose. Punishment exists to settle a debt. Preparation exists to build a capacity. When something in your life is being delayed for the sake of preparation, it is not because you failed to earn the answer, but because the answer itself requires a version of you that did not yet exist when you first prayed for it. Consider this honestly for a moment. If the very thing you were asking for arrived too early, before certain things had been formed in you, would you actually be able to carry it well? Would your character, your patience, your sense of identity be strong enough to hold what you are requesting without it slipping through your hands or distorting into something unhealthy? This is not meant to suggest that you are unworthy or unprepared in some shameful sense. It is meant to gently suggest that growth has a natural order, and that order often requires time. You cannot rush through sheer determination or guilt. Think of someone learning to carry something heavy. If you handed them the full weight on day one, before their strength had developed, the weight itself could injure them. Not because the weight was wrong, but because the timing was wrong. The same can be true of answered prayer. Some answers, if given too soon, would overwhelm a heart that had not yet learned how to receive them without falling back into old patterns of fear, control, or instability. This is where the waiting begins to take on a different shape entirely. Instead of being a measurement of your worth, it becomes a quiet workshop, a place where inner formation happens slowly, away from the pressure of immediate results. And this formation is rarely dramatic. It does not usually announce itself with loud revelations or sudden bursts of clarity. It shows up in small, almost imperceptible shifts. A slightly longer pause before reacting to disappointment. A little more patience with people who used to irritate you instantly. A growing ability to sit with uncertainty without spiraling into worst-case scenarios the way you once did. These shifts are easy to dismiss because they don't feel like answers. They feel like background noise, unrelated to the actual prayer you've been praying. But what if these very shifts are the answer beginning to take root? Not in your circumstances yet, but in you. What if the patience you are slowly developing right now is not a side effect of waiting, but the actual point of this season? Something being built specifically so that when the visible answer finally arrives, you are someone capable of stewarding it well rather than someone who simply survives it. This reframing requires a kind of honesty about your own life. It asks you to look back over the past months or years, not for evidence of punishment, but for evidence of formation. Are there ways you respond to stress now that are different from how you used to respond? Are there relationships where you've grown steadier, more grounded, less reactive? Are there moments where you noticed yourself trusting just slightly more than before, even without proof that things would work out? These are not random improvements. They are the quiet output of a process that has been happening underneath the frustration of unanswered prayer. A process that punishment could never produce, because punishment isolates and shames, while preparation strengthens and matures. As you sit with this shift in understanding, a new tension begins to emerge, one that feels slightly less heavy than fear of punishment, but still unresolved. If this season truly is preparation rather than punishment, what exactly is it preparing you for? Is it simply for the answer itself, or is it for something larger? Some capacity you will need, not just to receive what you've asked for, but to walk faithfully in whatever comes after it. That question lingers now, not as fear, but as curiosity. A small shift from dread toward wonder, even though the full picture is still forming. Somewhere in the middle of this season, almost without you noticing at first, something begins to change in the way you carry your waiting. It does not happen all at once. There is no single dramatic moment where anxiety lifts and trust simply arrives in its place. Instead, it happens the way most real transformation happens. Quietly, gradually, almost too subtly to track in real time. One day you realize you went through an entire afternoon without checking your phone for news that wasn't coming. One day you noticed that a wave of worry rose up in your chest the way it always does. But this time, it didn't pull you all the way under the way it used to. This is the first visible shift worth naming honestly. Restless faith, slowly becoming still trust. It is important to understand what this shift is not. It is not the disappearance of every question. It is not a sudden absence of pain or longing. You can still want the answer deeply, still feel the ache of its absence, and still be growing in trust at the very same time. Trust was never meant to be the absence of unresolved questions. It is the capacity to remain steady in the presence of them. This distinction matters because so many people believe that real faith should feel like certainty, like a settled confidence that everything will work out exactly as hoped, free of doubt or tension. But true trust, the kind that holds up under real pressure, often looks much quieter than that. It looks like continuing to pray even when you don't feel a surge of faith while doing it. It looks like choosing not to spiral into worst-case thinking, even though the thoughts still knock at the door. It looks like resting, even slightly in the middle of uncertainty. Instead of demanding that uncertainty resolve itself before you're willing to feel any peace at all. Much of your anxiety up to this point may have come from an unspoken belief that you are responsible for making the answer happen. That if you just thought hard enough, prayed hard enough, or controlled enough variables, you could force the outcome into existence through sheer mental effort. This is exhausting work, and it is work that was never actually yours to carry. Overthinking often masquerades as diligence, as taking your situation seriously, but in reality, it is frequently just fear wearing the costume of responsibility. The mind convinces itself that constant analysis is protective, that if you stop turning the problem over and over, something bad might happen because you weren't vigilant enough. But this kind of mental striving rarely produces clarity. It usually produces exhaustion, looping the same fears in slightly different shapes without ever actually solving anything. The shift towards stillness begins when you start to recognize this pattern for what it is, and gently, without self-judgment, begin practicing surrender instead of striving. This does not mean passivity, and it does not mean pretending you don't care about the outcome. It means releasing your grip on the parts of the situation that were never within your control to begin with. The timing, the method, the specific way the answer will unfold. Practically, this surrender often begins in small, almost unremarkable moments throughout an ordinary day. It might look like noticing a spiral of anxious thought begin to form, and instead of following it all the way down, simply naming it honestly. I am afraid this won't happen. I don't know when this will change. And then, instead of trying to immediately fix that fear with more thinking, choosing instead to bring it back to a simple, honest posture before God. Even if no audible resolution follows, it might look like setting a boundary with your own mind, refusing to rehearse the same worry for the 5th time in one day, not because the worry isn't valid, but because rehearsing it endlessly has never once produced peace. It might look like returning to a single truth, repeated quietly throughout the day, not as a magic phrase, but as an anchor. Something like, I don't have to carry this alone right now. These small moments may seem insignificant compared to the size of what you're waiting for, but they are exactly where stillness is trained. Stillness is not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It is a practiced response, built one moment at a time, often in seasons that offer no other choice but to either fight constantly or learn to rest. There is something worth sitting with honestly here, because this shift, as good as it sounds, often comes with an unexpected discomfort. Surrender can feel like loss before it feels like peace. Letting go of the constant mental grip you've had on your situation can feel, at first, like abandoning it, like giving up on it entirely. This is a normal and important tension to notice rather than avoid. You are not giving up on the outcome you're hoping for. You are giving up the illusion that you are ever capable of controlling it through worry alone. As that illusion slowly loosens its grip, something quieter and steadier begins to take its place. Not because the circumstances have changed yet, but because the way you are carrying them has. And this raises a new question worth holding on to as we continue. If this growing stillness is not dependent on the external answer arriving, what is it actually pointing toward? What is being formed in this quiet space that the original prayer alone never could have produced? As stillness begins to settle in, something else starts to shift. Something that surprises many people precisely because it doesn't arrive the way they expect. There is, somewhere in the middle of this waiting season, an unexpected return of hunger, a desire to open scripture or sit in prayer that doesn't feel forced or obligatory the way it once did. For a long time, prayer may have felt like a transaction, a repeated request sent into silence, hoping eventually to receive a response. Reading scripture may have felt like a discipline you maintained out of guilt, something you knew you should do, even when it produced little felt connection. But now, almost without explanation, there is a quiet pull toward these things that feels different. Not duty, desire. You find yourself wanting to sit in stillness longer than necessary. Not because you're trying to extract an answer from God through persistence, but because something in that stillness has started to feel like home. This shift matters more than it might initially seem, because it reveals something significant happening beneath the surface. Something that has little to do with the original request and everything to do with the relationship surrounding it. For much of this season, the focus may have been almost entirely on the outcome, the specific thing being asked for, the breakthrough still missing. But somewhere in the waiting, attention has slowly begun to move from the request itself to the presence behind the request. This is not a small shift. It is, in many ways, the heart of what this entire season has been quietly working toward. Alongside this renewed hunger, something else begins to emerge. Something almost paradoxical given the circumstances. Peace, appearing not after the answer, but in the middle of its absence. This peace does not erase the longing for resolution, and it does not pretend the unresolved situation no longer matters. but it exists alongside the unresolved situation rather than waiting for it to be solved first. You may notice moments where, despite nothing having changed externally, something internally feels lighter, steadier, less frantic than before. This kind of peace is worth paying close attention to, because it cannot be manufactured through willpower or positive thinking alone. It tends to arrive as a quiet byproduct of everything that has been happening underneath the surface during this season. The stillness practiced in small moments. The surrender chosen again and again, even when it felt uncomfortable. The slow turning of attention from outcome to presence. Alongside this internal shift, there is often a deeper change taking place, one that touches identity itself rather than just emotion. For a long time, your relationship to this unanswered prayer may have felt like begging, like pleading with someone who held all the power while you held none, repeating your case again and again in hope of finally being heard. But as trust deepens and stillness grows, something in that posture begins to change. Instead of approaching this season from a place of desperate pleading, you may notice yourself shifting toward something closer to confident waiting. An identity rooted not in proving your case well enough to deserve an answer, but in trusting the character of the one you've been asking. This is the difference between striving and resting, between performing faith and actually living from it. Striving says, I must convince. Resting says, I am already known, and I am choosing to trust, regardless of timing. This shift in identity does not happen because the circumstances changed first. It happens because something has been quietly forming in you throughout this entire season. Something that was never visible in the outward results you were searching for, but was very real nonetheless. This is worth naming honestly, because it can be easy to dismiss internal change as insignificant compared to external change. If the actual situation hasn't shifted yet, what good is a shift in how you feel about it? But this question misunderstands something important about how preparation works. God is not only interested in answering a request, He is interested in forming a person capable of carrying that answer. Well, someone who will not immediately fall back into anxious striving the moment the breakthrough arrives, but who has learned, through this very season of waiting, how to hold both fulfillment and uncertainty with the same steady trust. If the answer arrived today, would the version of you from months ago, the one consumed by anxious pleading, have been ready to receive it, the way the version of you forming right now is becoming ready? This question deserves honest reflection rather than a quick answer, because it reveals something crucial about timing. Sometimes the delay is not about withholding the gift, but about preparing the hands that will hold it. As you sit with this shift, identity slowly moving from begging toward trusting, from striving toward resting, a new and gentler question begins to surface. If this internal transformation has been happening all along, quietly, beneath the noticeable absence of an answer, does that mean the answer itself might be closer than it feels? This question doesn't resolve the tension completely, but it does begin to shift the emotional weight of the waiting, turning resignation into something closer to quiet, attentive hope. There is a particular kind of attention that begins to develop once stillness and trust have had time to settle into the soul. An attention that notices things which would have gone completely unseen in an earlier, more anxious season. These are the small confirmations, the quiet nudges, the details that seem almost too minor to matter, yet somehow carry a weight that feels different from ordinary coincidence. A conversation that happens to touch exactly on what you've been wrestling with internally, a passage of scripture that seems to speak directly into a question you hadn't even said out loud, a sudden, unexplainable sense of peace settling over you in a moment that would normally trigger panic, a door closing in a way that initially feels disappointing, but later reveals itself to have protected you from something you couldn't see clearly at the time. These moments rarely arrive with fanfare. They tend to be quiet, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away as random chance if you're not paying attention. And this is precisely where a temptation often surfaces, one worth naming honestly. After so long without a clear, undeniable answer, there can be a deep hunger for something big, something unmistakable, a sign so large it removes all doubt at once. When the actual confirmations that show up are small and quiet instead, it can be tempting to dismiss them entirely, to think, that's not enough, that doesn't count, I need something more obvious than this. But consider, for a moment, how God has moved throughout history in the lives of those who walked closely with Him. Before the larger breakthroughs, there were often whispers first, a still, small voice before a powerful wind, a quiet dream before a public deliverance, a gentle conviction before a dramatic change of direction. This pattern suggests something important about how movement often unfolds before it becomes fully visible. The whisper tends to come before the shout. The small alignment tends to come before the obvious breakthrough. If this is true, then dismissing the small confirmations as insignificant may actually mean missing the very evidence you've been asking to see, simply because it didn't arrive in the form you expected. This requires a kind of recalibration, training your attention to notice alignment without forcing meaning onto things that don't actually carry it. This distinction matters because it would be just as unhealthy to manufacture significance out of every small coincidence as it is to dismiss every quiet nudge entirely. The goal is not paranoid searching for hidden messages in everything around you. The goal is simply a quiet attentiveness, a willingness to notice when something lines up in a way that feels meaningfully aligned with what you've been carrying, rather than assuming nothing ever counts unless it arrives as an undeniable, dramatic event. As you begin practicing this kind of attentiveness, something becomes clearer over time. You start to realize that these small confirmations have likely been present for longer than you initially recognize. They were not new occurrences that suddenly began once you started paying closer attention. They were there all along, quietly accumulating, while your earlier anxiety and fixation on the missing big answer kept you from noticing them. This realization carries a particular kind of comfort, because it means you have not been forgotten or overlooked during this season, even when it felt that way. Movement has been happening. Alignment has been occurring. It simply required a different kind of attention to perceive it. The same attention that has been forming in you throughout this entire process. The stillness, the surrender, the shift from begging toward trusting. In a strange way, the very transformation that has been happening internally is also what allows you to finally see what has been happening externally all along. Your heart, in many ways, is now catching up to what God has already been doing, work that began long before you had the eyes to recognize it. This brings us to a turning point worth sitting with honestly. If the small confirmations have been present for a while, even if only recently noticed, and if the internal transformation has been quietly building this entire season, what does it actually mean when the heart finally catches up to what has already been happening? It does not necessarily mean the external answer arrives the very next moment, though it certainly could. What it means, more importantly, is that the season of feeling completely lost in the dark, convinced that nothing was happening at all, is beginning to close. Not because circumstances have suddenly resolved, but because you have begun to see clearly what was always true beneath the surface. The waiting was never empty. It was full of quiet movement the entire time. Movement in your heart, movement in small details, movement preparing both your character and your circumstances to meet at exactly the right moment. A moment that, while still unknown to you, no longer feels as distant or as uncertain as it once did. There comes a point in every long season of waiting where something settles. Not because every question has been answered, but because the right question has finally been found. For so long, the question underneath everything was, has God forgotten me? That question, left unexamined, fed every anxious thought, every quiet comparison, every moment of self-blame, disguised as humility. But now, having walked through this slowly, honestly, without rushing past the pain of it, a different understanding begins to take its place. The silence you carried for so long was never proof of absence. It was the sound of preparation happening in a place too deep for ordinary eyes to see. The way roots form underground long before anything visible breaks through the soil. Every part of this season, the ache, the self-doubt, the fear of punishment, the slow turning toward stillness, the unexpected hunger for prayer that returned without force, the quiet identity shifting from begging to trusting, the small confirmations you almost dismissed, all of it was part of the same unbroken process. None of it was wasted. None of it was random suffering with no purpose attached. It was formation, careful and unhurried, the kind that cannot be rushed without damaging what it's meant to produce. This is worth saying plainly, because it deserves to be heard clearly rather than left as an abstract idea. Your faith was growing in the dark long before you ever saw evidence of it in the light. The patience you didn't think you had was being built in the very moments you felt most impatient. The trust you doubted you possessed was forming in the exact seasons where trust felt nearly impossible to access. This is how preparation tends to work. It rarely announces itself while it's happening. It only becomes visible in hindsight. Once you finally have enough distance to look back and recognize the shape of what was being built the entire time, if you are still in the middle of this season, as you hear this, still waiting for the outward answer to catch up with the inward transformation already taking place, this truth remains just as real for you. The very fact that you have stayed engaged with this process, that you have continued asking real questions instead of settling for either blind denial or bitter resignation, is itself evidence that something is alive and moving in you right now. Fear says that delay means rejection. Truth says that delay, more often than not, means preparation. Fear says you must keep striving harder to force an answer into existence. Truth says you are invited to rest in a trust that does not depend on controlling outcomes you were never meant to carry alone. Fear says the heaviness you felt for so long is permanent, an unavoidable weight you'll always have to manage. Truth says heaviness can give way to peace, not because circumstances changed first, but because something deeper shifted underneath them, something that began long before the outward situation ever moved. This shift from fear into trust, from confusion into clarity, from heaviness into peace, is not a single dramatic moment most of the time. It is a quiet accumulation. Much like everything else described throughout this journey, small moments of surrender repeated until they become a settled posture rather than an occasional effort. If you find yourself today still waiting, still without the visible answer you've been asking for, let this be the truth you carry forward from here. You are not forgotten. You were never forgotten. The silence you interpreted as absence was, all along, filled with quiet movement. Movement, preparing your heart, aligning your circumstances, and forming in you a capacity to receive what's coming in a way that honors it fully, rather than grasping at it anxiously. This does not mean the waiting becomes easy from this point forward. It means the waiting becomes meaningful. Understood now as part of something larger than the immediate request. Something concerned not just with what you receive, but with who you are becoming in the process of receiving it. As you move forward from here, let your prayers shift slightly in tone, not abandoning your requests, but resting them inside a deeper trust that does not require immediate proof to remain steady. Let your attention stay open to the small, quiet confirmations along the way, without demanding they arrive as something larger than they are. And let the peace that has been slowly forming in you continue to grow, not as a denial of what's still unresolved, but as evidence that something real has already shifted, regardless of how long the outward answer takes to fully arrive. If this brought you any clarity, any sense of being understood in a season that has felt isolating, consider letting that be known. A simple comment about where you are in your own waiting could become an encouragement to someone else walking through the very same silence tonight. If this spoke to something true in you, sharing it or subscribing helps this kind of reflection reach others who may be carrying the same unspoken question you carried at the beginning of this.